My time is short, so I want to make just a few key points and invite you to read my paper for any additional insights that I may have about the United States security role in the Far East. Let me begin with a couple of general observations. We have 70 years of peace, economic development in Asia with no great power conflict. You're welcome. Is America in decline? America is not in decline. To quote my namesake, Frank Sinatra, the best is yet to come. Where does the United States get the idea that China wants the United States to leave Asia? Perhaps it is connected not to the statements of your leadership, but to the statements of your Navy, which yesterday said, 你们走, 走. And they did not say, 海军欢迎你. I think that the United States cannot solve Asia's security problems. I think that it has been well said this afternoon that Asian security problems should best be served by Asian nations. And although the United States is not an Asian country, we are a Pacific power. And I would present to you that there are many security challenges in East Asia that Asian countries are not yet ready to solve. Perhaps many of the non-traditional and transnational challenges can be addressed very effectively by Asian nations working in partnership with other countries in a kind of an open security architecture. I think that piracy and refugee migration and poverty alleviation, infrastructure challenges, many of these issues, including things like the SARS epidemic, could be effectively addressed. But unfortunately, the real challenges, I think, that persist in East Asia, the challenges that could lead to great power conflict, are those which are not well suited to an Asian solution. In this afternoon's first session, 3 of the presenters talked about their perspective, and it was interesting to me that none of them mentioned Korea. But of course, our Korean guest did focus on the Korean challenge. And I want to use the challenge of North Korea as a prime example for why the United States has a meaningful role to play in helping Asia to manage its security problems, and why that role is essential. Because it is on the Korean Peninsula where a nuclear-armed North Korea, which has included nuclear weapons into its constitution, which has conducted 3 nuclear weapons tests, and which has recently launched a Russian-manufactured submarine-launched ballistic missile, is posing an essential security challenge to the future of Northeast Asia, a challenge which the Asian nations have failed to deal with, and a challenge which would be much, much worse if South Korea and Japan were left to deal with the threat of North Korea's nuclear capacity on their own. I don't think anyone in Asia wants to see South Korea and Japan develop nuclear weapons, but I believe that it's precisely what would happen if the United States nuclear umbrella did not exist, safeguarding South Korea's security against a nuclear-armed North Korea and providing that same nuclear umbrella over Japan. Both South Korea and Japan could easily, within weeks, if not months, develop nuclear weapons, and I believe that both would do so without the U.S. nuclear guarantee. The failure of Asia to resolve the Korean situation sometimes is also blamed on the United States. They say, well, Korea would be reunified if only the United States were gone. Perhaps, and it might have been reunified in 1951 under the DPRK, and I don't think anyone believes that the Korean people would be better off today under the administration of Kim Jong-un ruling over both North and South Korea. So I will say that we are guilty as charged in preventing the unification of Korea in 1953, but we are not an obstacle to the reunification of Korea in the future. In fact, it is something that we passionately believe in, along with the Korean people, North and South. So let me turn now just to the thrust of my main point in my paper, and to conclude my remarks with the transition, which I believe is necessary in the U.S. security architecture. I think the U.S. security architecture is antiquated, 比较落后. It is a Cold War architecture that is badly in need of refurbishment and remodernization. It was an architecture built originally, as was said earlier today, on a common threat, right? The threat of the Soviet Union. And it needs to transition into an open, inclusive architecture based on common interests. I think that it's very true that modern alliances typically are no longer oriented against a single national threat. Certainly, the U.S. alliance structure in East Asia is not oriented against any one particular national threat, with the possible exception of North Korea, where its role is entirely defensive, right? Entirely defensive. So what does this mean? It means that the United States should promote a more open, inclusive, functional multilateralism. This is a little different than the Asian Security Council concept that was introduced earlier today, because it is built potentially on existing U.S. relationships. But I believe that we see some promising examples of how the U.S. security hub-and-spoke system can be expanded and become more open. If you look at the work being done to patrol the Straits of Malacca, if you look at the anti-piracy initiatives in the Gulf of Aden, you see examples of how U.S. bilateral cooperation with nations like Japan have become more open, to include Chinese naval vessels, to include NATO or European naval vessels. And I think in East Asia, the future of the U.S. alliance system is one which is going to be marked by this kind of open, inclusive multilateralism. Washington is not prepared to bet its future and its interests in Asia on the hope that Asians will be able to come together and solve their great power rivalries. Why is this? It really is rooted in history. And my most admired historian is the Greek historian Thucydides. And Thucydides wrote that nations go to war for three reasons: honor, fear, and interests. In East Asia, interests are compelling integration, economic teamwork, openness, inclusiveness, and cooperation. Many mutual interests are at work in a very positive way in East Asia. And China's own Silk Road initiatives are an example of this mutually beneficial style of economic integration. But still, there are questions of honor and fear. Honor, as embodied in the tension between Japan and its neighbors over issues of history, and fear. What kind of fear? Fear of the unknown, fear of the uncertain, especially fear of the uncertain path of China as it continues to grow and have an ever larger role in the world. Personally, I think the world can rely on China to be a very constructive, responsible stakeholder. But I think, as my predecessor said, it is yet to be determined precisely what kind of a role China is going to play. And that uncertainty is still, I think, a cause of some anxiety in the region. So I could say a lot more, but I want to close by citing some positive examples of the kind of functional multilateralism that I believe can be built on the U.S. alliance structure. One is exactly the Cambodian the Cambodian peace process, which involved both great power negotiations as well as a leading role for ASEAN. And the U.S. and Russia working together along with China and great powers, helped to facilitate an Asian solution, mostly Asian solution, to a mostly Asian problem. But the Cambodian Civil War also had many international dimensions, and that was why it required a international solution. The other major example is the six-party process. And I would say that the United States is ready to resume the six-party process whenever North Korea demonstrates it has any serious interest in it. Unfortunately, I think North Korea has no interest in the six-party process, and we're going to have to come up with a five-party approach to try to deal and manage with the North Korean nuclear threat. But nonetheless, I think the six-party process shows the value of U.S. engagement in an East Asian security problem, and it's one for which I think Asian nations, the U.S. is not looking for thanks, but I think it's one for which the United States would like Asian countries to acknowledge that the U.S. can play a constructive role in an Asian security challenge that Asia is not yet prepared to solve on its own. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.